Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the 8 competencies of safety leaders excellence. Today, we'll explore a model that has been scientifically validated for effective safety leadership. We'll also explore cross-industry data and benchmarking for safety leadership, as well as the relationship between effective safety leadership and organizational safety climate. Lastly, we'll also build the case or help you get insight on how you can build the case for investment in safety leadership in your organization. My name is Thibaut Vincent and I'm a principal consultant with Centis. But before we jump into today's content, let me share with you some of the function of our webinar panel. So as you can see, this little orange arrow on the top left is what you can open and close if you want to get this off your screen. All participants for today's webinar will be muted. You can send your comments and question in the question tab throughout today. We'll have some time at the end for a Q&A, so please keep your questions for today's Q&A section. If you've got a real query you'd like to explore a little bit more with us. And today's webinar is being recorded. If you have to duck out of the webinar halfway through, you'll be receiving a recording once today's presentation has come to an end. So let's get started. Look, a little bit about us, Centis. Our mission is to change the lives of individuals and organizations for the better every day. The way we do this is through the application of psychology and neuroscience to workplace safety context, essentially helping people make better decisions to go home every day and feel like they have more control over what they're doing when it comes to safety. My name is Thibaut Vincent. I'm a principal consultant. My role is to engage with executive leadership team to help them shape their safety culture strategy and implement the activities that will get them to their next level of maturity. The agenda for today is first to explore that safety leadership link. So what is the correlation between safety leadership and organizational safety climate? We'll then dive into the 8 safety leadership competencies that I mentioned earlier and that model for effective safety leadership. We'll explore those competencies in practice. So it's one thing to understand the theory behind effective safety leadership. It's another to understand how we can pull the right lever at the right time when we're in situations. And we'll walk you through a few steps that you can take to start putting stuff in action at the end of today. Without further ado, let's start and talk about the safety leadership link. Before we do that and dive into the nuts and bolts, I think it's helpful for us to understand when we talk about safety culture here at Centis, what do we talk about? So I thought we'll introduce our safety culture model. This is based on the work of Scott E. Gellert. What this model really speaks to is the idea that if you want to have a positive safety culture, you need to have a holistic view around safety culture. And there's really 4 macro themes or components that you need to be aware of. One is your practices, which is everything that codifies the way you do safety, from your procedures to your meeting rhythm to your training occurrences, everything that codifies safety and is written about safety. Your environment, which is everything you can wear, everything you use, like tools and machinery, PPEs, but also the design of your environment and how it's been engineered to keep you safe. There's the person component, which is the aggregation really of attitude, behaviors, skills, and abilities of people in your organization. And I'll stop there for a second. I want you to think of those 3 components that are central to this model as a 3-legged stool. What happens if you remove one of the leg? Well, the stool falls apart. Safety is no different. These 3 components are key and interdependent and should be reviewed in a holistic way. Now, there's one key component that I haven't mentioned just yet, and that's your leadership component. As you can see, it sits around the 3 other components. There's a few reasons for that. I like you to think of leadership as the glue that holds that central model together, because leadership can influence the person. Leadership can also influence the environment and the practices. And that's why today we'll be focusing solely or mostly on the leadership component of our safety culture model. So, how does leadership impact safety culture? Well, we ran a research, or a survey, you might say, that you can dive into. There's a white paper on our website called the Safety Leadership if you're interested in going into further depth. But essentially, we sampled 11 1,500 people across 7 industries to try and understand how safety leadership impacted organizational safety climate. And what we found is this. First of all, safety climate is indicative of safety leadership ability. What that means is that when people in an organization reported really high, strong, positive perception of the capabilities of safety leaders in the organization, we also saw a correlation with overall organizational safety climate, which may not come as a surprise, right? Effective safety leadership, great organizational safety climate. What we also found was that increased production pressure or a poor production versus safety balance was felt by the individual that also reported poor safety leadership. What it means is pretty low perception of abilities of leaders, people reporting high perception of production pressure, all things getting in the way of doing the job safely. Interestingly, when we saw improved safety leadership in those organizations, what we also could correlate this with was improved safety behaviors at a teams level, so better leaders, better teams, but also, and that comes together quite naturally, better safety performances in those organizations. Last but not least, there's a strong opportunity to address well-being climate through safety leadership. And that might come as a surprise to some people, but if you think about it, it makes sense. When people reported strong capabilities for safety leadership by their leaders in the organization, they also reported higher well-being climate. In fact, it's the strongest correlated of those two, right? And that makes sense to me. If you have a good relationship with your leader, or if you've got a positive perception of your leaders in organization, it's quite natural that you will feel better. You thrive in an organization where you feel supported by leaders. And like I like to say, there's no amount of fruit bowls or surface level well-being initiative that are going to fix a bad relationship with your boss. Now, again, this is the strongest relationship between safety leadership and climate indicator. So when you see here all the climate indicator that were part of this survey, try to, in a simplified view, well-being climate is the most strongly correlated. But really, they're all very, very strongly correlated with effective safety leadership, whether it's safety training transfer, communication, or even the error management climate. We see that increased safety leadership perception means increased safety climate perception. Now, if we boil it down to one sentence, really, is that poor safety leadership impacts team safety behaviors in a negative way. What I mean by that is, you can see, you may be familiar here on the screen with our safety culture maturity model. Organization go through safety culture maturity, and we deem it to be from counterproductive all the way through citizenship, which is the gold standard. And when we see poor safety leadership in organization, what we see is an increase in behaviors and attitudes that are the hallmark of negative safety culture. So here, counterproductive in public compliance. On the flip side, though, when you have strong positive perception of safety leadership skills by employees and people in the organization, we see improvement in those positive safety culture maturity type levels, right? We see more discretionary effort, more people suggesting improvement, but likewise, a decrease in those negative safety behaviors, making leadership or management commitment one of the key levers to driving organizational safety performances. Before we jump into that model of what good looks like, I thought it'd be interesting to reflect on what could be the symptoms for you in your organization of not so great safety leadership, because it's good to be able to identify the symptoms to diagnose the problem, right? So here's a few. I won't read through the list, and you'll get a recording after if you want to revisit this. But essentially, if you notice that there's very little transfer from what's being taught in training back into day-to-day activities, that's probably a good example that the leaders are unable to articulate how those skills apply every day. Good indication of poor safety leadership. If you see that safety violation or mistakes are being dealt with unfairly by leadership, that's another good indication. So let's say someone doesn't wear the right PPE on the job. If the leader sees the same mistake done twice, but deal with the two individuals very differently based on the relationship, that's probably a good indication of poor safety leadership. If people are not speaking up, or the seriousness of incident are being downplayed, that's probably suggesting there's a low level of trust or no real belief in the ability of the leader to represent them effectively upwards. If Another good one would be, your pre-start meetings are essentially a leader talking to the team instead of with the team. Another good example of poor safety leadership. Now, there's many others there that I'll invite you to reflect on to see if this could be an opportunity for you and in your organization. But I think it's important that we move into what good looks like and spend probably more time there. So I'm about to unpack with you that model for the effective safety leadership or 8 safety leadership competencies that we've mentioned. Before I jump into this, probably worth mentioning the validation process that we went through. We gathered essentially all data. We did a literature review on effective leadership and effective safety leadership, what best practice suggested, went through a few testing process to boil it down to what actually really works. There's been a lot of thoughts and review of both transactional and transformational leadership theory to get to that model. And while some of you might think, well, transactional leadership theory, that's a bit dated, um, surprisingly, it's actually really effective in the context of certain safety situations that we'll explore shortly. So without further ado, the 8 safety leadership competencies that we know are effective at driving better safety performances in organizations. So they are vision, inspiring, actively caring, role modeling, supporting people effectively, being able to practice effective recognition and recognizing, challenging, collaborating. So we've had a few questions today that came through before the webinar asking us to give a little bit of some example of those. So what I'll do now is probably unpack individually those competencies to try to give you a clear picture of what that looks like in practice. So first, the vision. Let's start at the top. Look, sharing a vision with the team is great. So it's great to know the vision of your organization when it comes to safety. I'll take a blanket statement, I'm safe every day, that we see quite often in organization, or similar statement. And that's great to know that. What's better is being able to help people understand what that looks like every day and join the dots essentially. What everyday activities contribute to that vision of home safe every day. So if leaders are able to do that, that's a great way to get people engaged with safety. Moving to inspiring the team towards the vision, I'll start by saying that being inspiring isn't necessarily being charismatic, right? Often people think that to be inspiring and motivational, you need to be charismatic. I'd say that's not always the case. Inspiring is finding what makes people tick. What is going to be encouraging and motivating, and how can you link this to the safety vision or goals that your organization have? That's what inspiring people is, and understanding what makes them tick. And to be fair, in order to do that, you probably need to be a bit actively caring for them. So that competency of actively caring is probably linked a little bit, overlaps with authenticity. It's that genuine care for the health, safety, and well-being of individuals within the team. So you're not checking in because it's are you okay once a year. You're checking in regularly and monitor their well-being and safety because you care. And that usually gets people to respect you and feel like it's an authentic relationship. So it's important to really actually care for your people. I'm not making the assumption that people aren't, but being aware of how we demonstrate that is also very important. Role modeling, so that's probably twofold. It's role modeling, safety compliant behavior and what good looks like in everyday operation. I'll also invite you to reflect on how you role model when things go wrong. So when you've made a mistake as a leader, what standards are you setting for the reaction that people may have or should have when things aren't going according to plan? How do you own it and take accountability for things that aren't working is also part of role modeling. Now, supporting your people is probably one of the competencies that's often misunderstood. So I'll tell you what supporting isn't. Supporting isn't doing the job for the people that are supposed to do the job, right? It's not helping them and do the doing. What supporting is, it's helping them understand what their expectations are of them. And it's quite transactional in nature, but really important in the context of safety. People need to understand what's expected of them, what they should be accountable for and should own when it comes to safety performances and safety behaviors. Your job as a leader isn't to do the safe work for them, it's to help them understand what good looks like and set the standard, but also hold them into account for those standards. So that's what supporting is. It's helping them understand what the organization and the team expects of them when it comes to acting safely. Moving on to recognition. Recognition is also quite transactional in nature, right? If you think about it, it's just interactions with people. Now, recognizing effectively is what we like to summarize a sentence as hunting the good stuff, looking out for what good looks like every day in the organization, and also what beyond expectation looks like, and being deliberate and conscious about recognizing those things when we see them. So we're not going fishing for problems, we're acknowledging good stuff when we see it, right? A good example of that that I often use is probably a lot of us have heard through our safety careers, you're not wearing the correct type of PPE for the job, right? Very few of us have heard, thank you for wearing the correct PPE today. That's how we stay safe every day, right? So it's being mindful of recognizing what we want people to do so they know what we're expecting of them and what gets rewarded in the organization essentially. Challenging, again, one that gets often misunderstood. It's not the ability to have very tough conversation all of the time with people. It's actually inviting people to think differently about a certain idea, concept, or a way to do a job safely. So challenging is really that ability to use effective questioning to help people think of a certain task differently and help lead them to where we want them to be. Collaborating, again, it's not doing what people want us to do because we think that makes them feel good. It's giving them the space for input and feel like they are involved in the decision making process when it comes to safety decision. So safety is something that's done with them, not to them. And what people really want, if you look at the literature, is actually just input. They want to feel like they weigh in into a decision making process. And that's really what collaborating is about. Doesn't mean that it will always be your way or their way. It just means that people have the ability to weigh in into a decision that's been made. Now, just another word probably on those transactional and transformational leadership competencies. Look, probably the key takeaway here is that you need both. You need both. You also need all the 8 safety leadership competency to work in synchrony for it to be effective. Meaning, you can't just be a good leader because you actively care about people if you don't know how to support them role model, right? All those 8 safety leadership competency are equally important and should be displayed. Some are nested in transactional leadership and important because you can put them on steroids. Is probably the best way to describe it through leveraging the other transformational leadership skills. So I'm keen to try and get a lay of the land and understand a few things here. Let's take a quick poll, and I'd like you to tell me in your organization, and that poll should come quickly up, what percentage of leaders do you think demonstrate strong safety leadership? Is it less than 20, 20 to 40%, 40 to 60%, 60 to 80, or perhaps more than 80% of people? So what do you think? Where are people at in your organization? What level of skills do you believe exist? I think that poll's progressing pretty well. Yep. So we're going to give it 15 more seconds before we close the poll maximum. We may just close the poll. Here are the results. So 31% of you think that probably 40 to 60% of leaders in organization display those skills effectively. We've got probably another 20% up, 60% and above, and another 2/4 in less than 20%, and between 20 and 40%. So quite interesting. There's a lot of spread here. Look, what our research is suggesting, if I can share my screen again, is that only 24% of leaders across industry demonstrate strong safety leadership. So you can flip that on its head and say, well, there's a quarter of leaders out there that are really good at driving safety performances. I think safety is something that we should get right? And having only 24% of leaders being effective in that space is something that somewhat concerns me, and I would like to invite you to think of. So you may be thinking to yourself, well, where's this 24% coming from? Well, that's where it's coming from. Another research that we led, and you can access our white paper on our website, called The State of Safety Leadership. Quite comprehensive, across 9 industries, led globally, with a sample of 8,000 participants rating or giving upward perception of their leaders. Likewise, with roughly 500 leaders giving a self-perception of you. So it's a combination in this study of 360 data, safety climate surveys, and people upward perception solely of their leaders. Look, what we found is a pretty interesting result cross industry. Here it is. And I'll start with the obvious. When we look at those average upward perception, now, probably worth mentioning, it's a highly stratified sample so that no industry is overrepresented in those 8,000, right? We roughly have the same amount of people from industry. It's not skewed by a big organization, let's put it this way. And when we look at that highly stratified sample, what we find is that roughly doesn't really matter which industry you find yourself in. People tend to think that you perform or your leaders are performing pretty much at the same level. Now, granted, they might be different across industry, and we see that, for instance, people have a better perception in industrial services than in utilities. When you put that against the scale on the left, it tells pretty much the same story, really, is that most people rate their leader in a fair range. So you see that scale going from 3.5 to 5.25, everything above 5 being positive, everything below 4 being negative. Mostly people rate their leaders in that fair range with, and this is the obvious part that I haven't mentioned, a deep cross-industry in the recognizing competency, which has been rated in some industry, sometimes negatively. Now, this is quite interesting to me, especially when you think of that transactional skill that is supposed to be leadership one-on-one and that we're consistently not getting right. That suggests a few things to me, but before I go there, I'd like to unpack with you a subsample that is telling a story that we know is a trend across organizations. So it's a smaller subsample. It's not the gospel, right, for 120 participants. And what this is the comparison between how people rated themselves, so leaders rated themselves, versus how teams rated their leader. And look, it's pretty obvious that if the blue line is the self and the gray line is the other, that while they may be rating fairly similarly on those competencies, leaders have probably rated themselves much higher than their team have. And here's the thing. I don't believe that means leaders have poor abilities necessarily. See, I think if, for instance, like let's take actively caring, if you rate yourself pretty high in actively caring, it probably means you really do care about your people. But if your team rates you pretty low, what this suggests to me is not that you're not caring, is that you have not necessarily pulled the right lever at the right time to show that you were. And that's where those 8 safety leadership competencies become crucial. We need to be able to make those lines go closer to one another, be comfortable with situational leadership or the application of those 8 safety leadership competencies. So before we move on to that practical application, probably a summary of what strong safety leadership look like. Well, first is your ability as leaders to create and maintain a work culture based on trust. And we know how important trust is when it comes to safety. If I don't have that baseline level of trust, people aren't going to come up with their issue or the potential incident that happened, or they're not going to give us the full story. If you don't have that trust relationship with your team as a leader, you could miss a lot of crucial information, and you want to have that baseline level of trust. I think it's the basis of a good safety culture, or positive safety culture. Good leaders also are able to inspire their team to go above and beyond because they want to, not because they have to. See, I think those vision and inspiring competencies, if they leverage effectively, help people understand why in the first place they would want to invest in safety or their time in safety, so that people feel like safety is something done for them, not to them. Now, the last very crucial aspect of strong safety leadership is the ability to help people think differently. How we challenge people to help them contribute to a continuous improvement culture when it comes to safety. How do we help them share their nuggets of gold, right, insight effectively through the use of effective questioning? It's probably one thing I'd like to invite you to reflect on. So we've unpacked those 8 safety leadership competencies. We saw the relationship between organizational safety climate and the effectiveness as leader to some extent display those competencies. What does it look like in practice? How do I leverage those in any given situation? I think it's a very warranted question, and I thought we'll probably take the opportunity to give you some sort of a guide, really, for how that happens every day. As I've mentioned earlier, this is a lot about pulling the right lever at the right time. And really, there's 4 strategies that safety leaders can use in any given situation. It's either the leader as the guide, the coach, the leader that empowers, or the advocate. So, mindful that the levers need to be pulled at the right time would suggest there's probably some situation where those 4 leadership personas, if I can call it, or safety leadership personas, would be best utilized. And here's a little bit of a framework for it. So in organization, you and your teams are going to go through over time different dynamics, right? So what we suggest in this model is that as trust grows between you and team members, but also their willingness to participate increase, you will need different strategy. Likewise, as people stay in organization and their tenure in organization um, differs, they'll have a different set of skills and understanding of the company processes when it comes to safety that would require for you to have a different approach. And if you balance their tenure and skills with the relationship that you have or the trust that you've built over time, well, you kind of land on different strategies. So let's say someone's new, someone's in the organization for a short period of time, they've got low tenure, they've got the skills they're bringing from another organization, but aren't familiar with the processes here. And let's face it, your relationship's pretty green. You just met them, or they've just been here for a couple of months. Well, we suggest that this is the opportunity for leaders to give guidance and act as guides, meaning we're going to focus on articulating the vision, direct people the right way, and give them a good understanding of what good looks like, but also make them feel like they belong and motivate them. As your relationship naturally will be nurtured and grow over time, you'd have to take a different approach, because what's working for a new employee may not work for someone that's been here for a year or so. This is where we believe leaders have to act as coaches. You've got to influence people, help them grow in that probably an easy space sometime where they've been here, they understand the process, but we want them to go further. So coaching, really important for leaders to be able to leverage that persona. And last but not least, when people have been there for a while, they have a good understanding, sometimes better than ours, of the process because they've been here longer. And we've got a good relationship with them where we've got high level of trust. This is the time where you give them the keys to the car, really. You empower them to really drive for you, essentially, and challenge them to think differently, give them the leadership lens, and hopefully help them grow beyond you as a leader, which should be your role. Now, there's one that I haven't mentioned yet, the advocate. Now, the advocate, while it might seem on face value that it's the one-size-fits-all leadership persona that I can use when I'm not sure, and to some extent it is true, it's also one I'd caution you against, because I think it's the one that requires more skills. It's probably the one that requires a little bit of mastery, a little bit of strongest understanding of those 8 safety leadership competencies and how to apply them. But it does apply in most situations. So again, would like to get you to contribute, and let's take a quick poll. Which of those 4 would you like to explore in further depth today? So I'm going to try to cover up on all of them. to give you an understanding, a bird's eye view, but I'd be really keen to understand which one you'd like us to spend more time unpacking should we have to, just because we may not have the time to go through all those four. So which are the ones that you feel will get you more value or best return on investment of your time today? All right, and this poll's going through. Got most people that have voted. Hopefully we can explore most of them. Still coming through. All right, let's see the results. So most of you are mostly interested in how do we coach people effectively, or how we empower people to be more effective at what they do without us. That's interesting. It's actually where I suggest most organizations have pain points, and we'll definitely spend more time on those. So first of those four strategies, I'll just quickly skim over the guide. What you can quickly realize is that you don't have to leverage all of the 8 safety competencies all of the time. Certain situations call for different ones. So as a guide, we need to help people understand what's expected of them through supporting and role modeling, give them a good sense of where we're going with the vision, but also reinforcing positive behavior through recognition. So I won't go through the tick and flick list. What I'll do is probably give you just the how real briefly when it comes to guiding leaders. Find the time when you want to be a guiding leader and really help your team grow. I'd say that as leaders, your time is probably the most valuable resource you can give to your teams. Think about it. When your leaders make time for you to help you understand and grow, how much do you value that time? Well, likewise, your people really value time with you. So think about how you give your time and what you dedicate time to as well. Join the dots for them, help them connect, how the vision relates to what they do every day. Give the people just enough rope, and I feel that this one almost bridges with a coaching approach. It's giving people the space, to fail, but in a safe environment, right? How do we give them just enough rope so they can experiment without being dangerous? And last is holding people to account. I mean, that makes sense. We need to make sure they understand what's acceptable, what's not in the organization. So the leader as the coach. So the reason why I spend a little bit on the time on the guide is because that's helpful to understand how we move into a coaching space. So hopefully you've done that well, right? You've given people the vision, you've inspired them and get them to buy into the vision. You've shown and demonstrated care so that people know that you're coming from a genuine place and they understand what's expected of them. What you now need to do is challenge them effectively to think differently about safety issues, and we'll explore the importance of questions in a second. You need to be able to collaborate and get people involved, ask them for their input, seek to understand before being understood is probably one of the tagline here. Suggest sources of inspiration, help them shape their future leadership journey, because they may be leaders one day themselves, even though they're in your team, or they might outgrow you and you want to give them those opportunities. Never close the feedback loop, right? Keep that recognition coming, whether it's for positive or hindering behaviors, and use a combination of tangible rewards and intangible rewards to acknowledge safety successes. So that might be, a written comment in a performance review, as well as the use of units of recognition on a day-to-day basis. How you do that? Well, you become a master of questions. So this is really, really crucial for you to understand that the best tool you have in your leadership toolbox is probably the quality of question you use. And I often say the quality of question that you will ask of people will often define the quality of outcomes you get. So asking open-ended questions that are exploratory in nature, where people broaden their perspective on a certain safety challenge and beyond safety, will be a very important tool to master if you want to help challenge people's attitudes. And one way to do that, if you're not familiar with appreciative inquiry, is to apply appreciative inquiry skills. Now, what that is a strengths-based approach, essentially, to problem solving. So instead of, ruminating on the problem and how it's impossible to fix, we look at what worked well either in this organization or other organizations, that we can leverage in the moment. And your role as a leader then is to ask the question that are going to help people get that insight, right? How they can leverage what they've done well in the past in the current time. Know what inspires your people. And look, you need to understand what makes people tick if you want to get them to be motivated. And a really good way to do that is understand what are their drivers, what they care about, where they want to be in life, what they value, so you can help them make the link with what they do every day and those things. The last is probably the most important takeaway, if I'm honest. Hold your ground and help people resolve their own challenges. I'll spend a bit of time on that. See, I often get into conversation with leaders that come to me and tell me, I don't understand why people just use me as a problem solving machine. People come to me, they always have a problem for me to solve, right? Most of the time, people come to me to get something done that they couldn't do themselves. My answer to that is probably you did that to yourself. See, what happened is people started in the organization, they came to you and they had a problem and you solved that problem straight away. So people learn, well, if I have a problem, I go to my leader because that's how I solve problems. And chances are, when they had another problem, they came to you and you helped them solve the problem again and again and again and again, creating some sort of dependency on you to be the problem solver. My recommendation is hold your ground. When people come to you with a problem and you see the answer, I'm guilty of that, we're all guilty of that. Don't tell them, just help them through the use of question get to the answer themselves. And if you do that often enough, what they probably learn is they don't need you to solve their problem. They need to think a little harder about it because they can come to the answer themselves. And that's a very good bridging way to the empowering leader. So, food for thought. Am I solving the problem of my team or helping them solve their problem themselves? Something that I'm very guilty of. So a leader as the empowerer, effective skills here. So you see that we're almost circling back to the initial skills that we had to use, which is vision and inspiring, while leveraging some coaching skills. At this stage, you want to tailor the safety vision to a specific target or growth area that your team member aspires to. So help them leverage their vision or the vision of the organization to grow in a certain space. Share information strategically with individuals so that you create a sense of personal responsibility and accountability, but also give them the room to act on those new responsibilities you may have given them through delegation. Provide opportunity for the crews to take more personal responsibility for their safety through delegation again, and encourage workers to recognize and reward each other for high safety performances. And this is a very crucial one. I think the empowering leader is the leader that can go on leave for 2 months and people say, well, the team is running themselves. That's the ideal state where you don't have to be there for the team to run, and you do that through empowering them to make their own decision and take accountability for their result, especially when it comes to safety. And a good way to do that is that we know that people replicate what they see or mirror what their leaders do. So become a master of effective recognition. Do it often, because when you recognize something often, you bring attention to it. So let's say you care a lot about people taking accountability. Recognize people taking accountability, because if it's important to you, it will become important to them. So consciously recognizing this will drive essentially attention, density to that concept. Learn to foster effective collaboration. Again, people want to know that they can give input. Learn when it's appropriate to collaborate and have an exploratory conversation. Learn when it's appropriate for them to just give their input and point of view in the decision you're making. Last but not least, it's important you give the keys of the car to those people, meaning you're going to have to be comfortable with delegating things that are important to them, so that one, they feel important and valued. Two, they get to try and maybe fail, and I guess that's okay. You're always there to step in, but also so they can learn how not to fail in the future and do it well without you. So it's almost back to that initial guide competency, which is giving enough rope, but this time in your arena to the people you can trust and have the necessary skills to execute on those. Try it. It's a bit uncomfortable, but you will get a result over time. I'll quickly review the advocate because I think it's important to understand that leadership persona or that situational application of all 8 safety leadership competencies. This suggests that you understand and you've got pretty high level of skills in all of those. What really you're trying to do as the advocate is being the link between senior leadership or executive leadership or the board if you're at that position, but also frontline. You're the glue really between the different vertically in the organization. Now, the way you do that is first by ramping up your emotional intelligence. What I mean by that is you understand what makes people tick across different levels of the organization. You understand how to influence and talk to different people in different level of the organization. But you also understand very well, if you have a pretty high EQ, what competency to leverage in what situation. So really key for you to understand. I'm faced with this situation now. I need to probably challenge their thinking, or I need to show that I care, or simply support them to understand what's expected. So really important to get a good gauge on what lever to pull at what moment. Ramp up your diplomacy skills. Very different skill to influence up than it is to influence down. But you need to do both very well if you're going to be the advocate. Know your safety vision, know your pitch. It sounds a bit salesy, but knowing your elevator pitch or how you would articulate your vision for safety if you had only 30 seconds to do so, it's probably a good thing to reflect on. Sometime, especially in the fast-paced environment we're in today, 30 seconds is all you have. And the more important your role is, the less time you have with people on the front line. And being able to articulate very succinctly and very effectively what you want to achieve for safety is a very important thing to know how to do, I believe, if you want to influence across the organization vertically. Now, a good example of someone that does that well is if you go in the organization and someone tells you, oh, yeah, Jerry always bangs down about how safety is about X, Y, Z, right? If people say that about a person, they probably have a good pitch crafted already. Last but not least, become a poster child for psych safety. And what we mean about psychological safety is creating the environment where people feel safe to speak up and be themselves at work, right? People often tell me there's the me at work and there's the me at home. And when I tell them if the me at home shows up at work often, you probably have a strong psychological safety climate. This is what you need to endeavor to create as a leader so that people feel comfortable telling you what pain points they're experiencing. And that's where you get the nuggets of gold. And you can both, and they essentially trust you to bring up their issue up. And likewise, you're bringing the upwards issue down. So very important if you have a future focus to be able to be an advocate leader as well. So this brings us to next steps. So we know safety leadership capability impacts safety both performances and also safety climate in organization. We know that most leaders aren't really performing well in those areas. In fact, only 24% are perceived to be. And we know that it requires a little bit of situational awareness and situational leadership skills to be able to pull those levers at the right time. What I'm suggesting, or what I'm going to suggest, is that if we want our people to be performing to the best of their abilities, we need to be equipping them with the right level of skill. So for people to be effective, everyday safety leaders, we need to help them understand and give them a clear view of the organizational context. That means share with them as much information you have when it comes to where the organization is going, what's our mission, what's our current state, so they can make decisions based on real, raw, factual data of every day. You want to understand where you're at, right? When we see symptoms, we can choose to go to the doctor and get a diagnostic, or we can choose to self-medicate and take our chances. Look, what I'll invite you to in an organization is to assess your people against their current level of leadership skills, whether against those 8 safety leadership competencies or other. It's really crucial to understand where you're at before you make a decision on how to. Um, Targeted training is going to be very crucial. You need to equip people with the skill necessary to perform to a certain expected level, right? And often when it comes to safety, I found, or in organization really, that really focus heavily on safety, a lot of people get promoted or go through the ranks, not because they're the best leaders, but because they were the best operators, which means they've got very strong technical knowledge, but not maybe very strong soft leadership skills. And I don't think it should be up to them to get up to speed. I think we should create, as leaders in organization, the climate or the environment that supports them to move quicker and accelerate when it comes to building leadership skills. And that's a very good thing. That's a thing that training does very well. Now, training is one thing, and training serves its purpose, but we also need people to make the link with how that applies to their everyday job. And coaching, we know, drive that training transfer really, really high. Like you need to have the ability to reflect on what you've learned into certain context to be able to apply those skills every day. So if you don't want to see training transfer erode over time, ideally you'd want to pair training occurrence with coaching so that people can apply those skills and reflect on them often, and it's still front of mind. You create that attention density and give them also the space to grow, which they're often really grateful for. So we've got 15 minutes left. I thought now would probably be the good time to start jumping into a bit of a Q&A. So I'll give you the opportunity to ask some of your questions. We've received some questions before the webinar started, and we'll get to them, and we'll try to cover as much ground as we can. But before we do that, probably call out to you, if you're on the call, what safety leadership skills do you have currently, and are you interested in developing those skills? So if you want to understand a little bit better how you can develop your leader, and that's something you're interested in, and you would like Santis to give you a little bit of guidance with, please let us know if you're interested. If you want more information, we can definitely contact and reach out to you to give you information. So while that poll goes through, I'll probably have a look at some of the questions that have been coming through. And Warren asked, how can you use leadership to address the momentum of a negative culture? That's a great question, Warren. I think, look, I'll make an assumption, right? And I don't know the context, so pardon me. But when you have a negative culture, based on what we've learned today, what we know is it strongly correlates with the skills of leaders. So perhaps there's some existing or legacy cultural artifact that have driven this negative safety culture. If you want to flip the switch or shift the dial, or shift that dynamic, what you probably need to look at, Warren, is what are the current skills of your leaders, and how can you help them advocate for a different culture and influence people in the organization? Because we know management commitment or perception of the leaders to safety is usually the key lever to change. Before I go to the next question, also probably giving you the opportunity to express your interest for a trial on our self-paced learning platform. We know that with COVID, training can be a bit challenging, or knowing how we can have impactful training without resorting to face-to-face is a challenge that people have faced. We know that self-paced flipped classroom approach work really, really well. So if that's something you're interested in knowing a little bit more about, or getting a free trial for 30 days, like we're offering today, please express your interest and someone will get in touch with you shortly after today or within a week. But going back to those questions, Stuart asked, what are some strategies for changing safety culture when your organization leaders are very poor at leading by example? Look, Stuart, to be quite straightforward, I think today gave a lot of those answers, and it's really helped them understand how they can be better role models and equip them with those skills. Coaching might be, given the tone of the question, one of the areas that encourage you to think about. We had another question coming through. How can you help another leader see their gaps in the competency framework? That's a very good question. Look, I'll suggest one thing. If you point out to people what they don't do well, they're probably not going to be very happy with you. So one of the things that we know worked really well is for people to self-assess, because self-report will give you a certain level of understanding where you're at, and encourage them to ask or to share with people that self-report, and have them ask, where do you think I'm at based on those results? So they've already reflected on those skills, and we encourage them to seek as opposed to being told. And we know that when people seek, they're more open to growth. So look, you can either use that lever, that's one. You can also ask questions very strategically to help them uncover some of the things they could be doing differently. So I hope that gives you a little bit of context. Difficult conversation is another skills that we all need to develop as leaders. I couldn't agree more. You need to be comfortable with difficult conversation as a leader. And I'll use an example that I often use is, we all as leader probably received that sandwich once in our life, the great stuff you're doing, the nasty stuff in the middle, and the other good stuff at the end of the sandwich. Look, I tend to say they don't work, and the literature would back me up. At best, it leaves people confused over the quality of their performances. What I'd encourage you to do is to don't give sandwiches, because they only make you feel good about yourself, right? When something isn't working, tell people what it is. And if you've done that recognition piece earlier on, so that competency of recognition, and you spend most of your time highlighting what works really well and hunting the good stuff, people will accept when you give them sometimes negative feedback. And no one's perfect. It's okay to give each other honest feedback. And some people will actually value you doing that. Katie asked, can you please share some behavioral indicator of each competency? We did that earlier on. That question came through before the webinar, I believe. Mark is asking, how can you deliver a message that makes a worker think differently about safety in the workplace, especially if they're disengaged and have a belief that safety only slows them down? That is a very good question. So it's back to that inspiring competency, right? How do we inspire people to see things differently? Look, one of my safe bets when it comes to those things is probably twofold. It's first understanding, hey, what makes that person tick? So I'd suggest, if you want to inspire someone, you need to understand how they tick a little bit. So what do they like? What's driving or motivating them? And then leverage this in the context of safety. One of the safe one is, family or strong intrinsic motivator, things that are important to them. And having you make the link between safety being for what they value as opposed to protect them from what could hurt them is a very compelling argument. So, if someone is really keen to go fishing on weekends, it's making the link. Safety isn't about making you do more paperwork. Safety is actually about you making sure you can go on your fishing trip with your mates on Friday. But that's an example. There's many others. It's leveraging those intrinsic motivators that help them shift their perspective around safety. Hopefully you do that as a guide when you're early in the relationship with the individuals. So I'm just going to move that screen here and keep going with your question. Very good discussion. Would handouts be available? Thank you. Yes, if you need to have a copy of some of the material, you'll get a recording after this session. And if you're interested in some of the studies that we've conducted, they're freely available on our website that I invite you to go and check out. Another question that came through, Frank asked, what challenges are created if senior management are focused on completing a major restructure whilst trying to embed a safety culture? Now, Frank, that's also a very good question. And it's also a quite often a current challenge. So we ran a separate study that we didn't mentioned today, where we looked at the key opportunities and strengths in organizations and according to their current level of safety culture maturity. And one of the trends that we've actually uncovered was that when there's a bit of internal turmoil and the internal context is a bit sticky, such like a restructure or things that put people a bit in stress responses, we tend to see that it correlates with a negative safety culture. And I think the key driver, especially in restructure, what I've seen is often people say, I don't care what gets made redundant. If it's me, just tell me. I just want to know. I think as leaders, our role, if we want to drive a positive safety culture or positive culture in that particular moment, is to be as transparent as possible. And sometimes it will be telling them every day, I don't know, I don't have an update, you'll be the first to know. And be as transparent as you can, because you're probably in the same position, right? And give them those opportunities to be kept in the loop, even if you don't have an answer for them. That's probably going to be my other invitation for you. Another question from Penny that asks, what is the advice for building on from an immature blame culture? That's another good question. Look, blame cultures are interesting to me because they can feel like it's really hard to pull yourself out of the hole, but a good change management process will often address that. So when people are pointing the finger of blame, telling them that it's their job, it's probably not going to work. Similarly to what we've explored earlier with another question. My advice is when you're in a blame culture, the best defense or the best way to move people forward is to, as leaders, take accountability and ownership for as much as we can to demonstrate that's the expected norm or behavior in the organization. So focusing on what we can influence and what's in our sphere of control is probably my call out for you, Penny, is what can I do to make things differently, and what can I take ownership of to influence others to do so as well. Last question before we close today's webinar. Kim asked us, where have you seen the successful integration of the safety leadership competencies into a broader competency framework in organization you have worked with? It's a very good question, very targeted. Look, what we see often in organization is that employee safety performances aren't necessarily linked back to their performance reviews. And you want to have people understanding clearly what's expected of them in a fairly simple manner. So what we'll invite you to reflect on, Kim, is how your organizational vision fits in those 8 safety leadership competencies and how that's reflected into a performance review matrix or a certain competency that's being assessed in the organization. Because if people can make the tangible link between what we tell them good looks like and what's being assessed formally more in the organization, that usually is a very good way of integrating this in a sustainable manner, and that becomes what we talk about every day. That's it for today. I think we won't be able to get to all the questions. My apologies. I hope you found this session valuable today. My name is Thibaut Vincent. Again, if you want to reach out to me, I'm no stranger. You can either send me an email or try to contact me on LinkedIn, and I'll endeavor to get back to you as quickly and promptly as possible, or as much time as I have or can. Thank you very much for attending today. Please get in touch with us. I hope this was valuable again, and wish you a very great end of this week, and stay safe. Thank you.